Hi, everyone. You're all doing so great. I'm so happy to see that you're studying and that you're watching these videos so that you can do your very best on Thursday tomorrow. Um, so, I just wanted to finish going over the inheritance questions part of the study guide. So, let's get started. Okay. So, the gene for tall is dominant over dwarf. Okay. So, our lowercase t is representing our recessive trait, and our uppercase letter is representing our dominant trait. In the garden pea plant used by Mendel. A pea plant that comes from a line of true breeding tall plants is crossed with a dwarf pea plant. What are the phenotypes and genotypes of the F1 generation? Okay, so first we want to ask ourselves, okay, what are the genotypes of the parents? So my first parent is a true breeding tall plant. Okay, if it's true breeding, this means it's going to be homozygous and it's a tall plant. So it's going to be homozygous tall. So this is my first parent. And my second parent says it's crossed with a dwarf pea plant. So dwarf is my recessive trait. So in order for it to show the dwarfism, it has to be homozygous recessive. Okay, so it can't be heterozygous because if it's heterozygous, then it would show up the dominant trait. Okay, all right, so it is not heterozygous. So then I would do a Punnett square. I will take my first parent. My first parent can either pass down a big T allele or a big T allele. Okay. And my second parent can either pass down a recessive allele or a recessive allele because they're both homozygous. Then we're going to ask ourselves, okay, if this gamete was fertilized with this gamete, what would the genotype of the offspring be, or of the zygote? It would be heterozygous. One big T, one small t. Okay, so the Punnett square that you should have drawn should look like this. Okay, and then let's try and answer the question. What are the phenotypes and genotypes of the F1 generation? So let's start with phenotype. This is the physical appearance, okay? What would the physical appearance of this one be, of this offspring? It would be tall because it has the dominant tall, right? And this would be tall, and this would be tall, and this would be tall. So what can we say for phenotype? 100% would be tall. Okay, phenotype is my physical appearance. My next question is, what would the genotype be of the F1 generation? Remember, F1 generation is my offspring. Well, they are all heterozygous. So my genotype would be 100% heterozygous. Okay. All right. Excellent. So now my next question is saying, okay, two plants from the F1 generation in the previous problem, I'm sorry, it says problem 3, in the previous problem are crossed. What are the genotypes and phenotype ratios of the offspring? So my F1 generation, two plants, all of that F1 generation in the previous problem was heterozygous. So basically I'm crossing two heterozygous parents. Okay. So my Punnett square heterozygous individual can either pass down a big T or a small t. Same thing here. And now I will say, okay, well, what would my zygotes be? If a big T and a big T are fertilized together, what would the genotype be? Okay, so when I do this Punnett square, your Punnett square should look something like this. But always when I do the Punnett square, first try it on your own and see if your answer matches what I have. Okay, so what are the genotype and phenotype ratios? Okay, this time let's start with genotype. Okay, and it doesn't say probability, it says ratios. Okay, so what is my ratio? I'm going to do homozygous dominant to heterozygous to homozygous recessive. This is my structure for my ratio. So how many homozygous dominant do I have? 1. How many heterozygous? 2. And I have 1 homozygous recessive. Okay, so this is my genotype ratio. I don't think the other one was ratio, was it? No. Okay. All right. Now we'll do phenotype. What is the difference for phenotype? This is the physical appearance. Okay. So my ratio is going to be how many individuals display or express the dominant allele and how many display or express the recessive allele. So this would be dominant. My heterozygous individual would display dominant. So 3 dominant offspring to every 1 recessive. So 3 tall to every 1 short or dwarf. Okay, let's move on. Okay, in humans, dimples are a trait that exhibits simple dominance. Okay, so in all of these questions in the first few, they're all simple dominance or complete dominance. So we know we're going to have a dominant trait and a recessive trait. So in humans, dimples are a trait that exhibits simple dominance. The 2 alleles for this trait are dimples and no dimples. A dimpled man, and you can see that this one is dominant and no dimples is recessive. A dimpled man whose mother has no dimples. Okay, what is his genotype? A dimpled man whose mother had no dimples. So he can either be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. If his mother had no dimples, that must mean his mother was small d, right? So his mother must have passed down, she couldn't have passed down a dominant allele. So she must have passed down a recessive allele. This tells me that this dimpled man must be heterozygous, not homozygous dominant, because his mother had no dimples, so she was homozygous recessive. So this individual marries a woman with no dimples. So what is that? The woman's genotype. If she has no dimples, it's going to be small d, small d. Okay, no dimples is the recessive allele. In order to express the recessive allele, you have to be homozygous recessive. So this is my cross, my parent 1 and my parent 2. What is the probability that their first child will have dimples? So now I'm going to make my Punnett square. Go ahead, try and compare it to mine. Okay, so your Punnett square should look something like this. If your parents are switched, it's okay. But what is the probability that their first child will have dimples? Dimples is my dominant allele. So which one will display dimples? 2 out of 4, or 50%. So 50% will have dimples, or the probability of 50%, because it's not 100%, right? It's just a probability. So there is a 50% probability that their first child will have dimples. Now, what is the probability that their second child will have dimples? Every child is brand new, okay? So the probability that their second child will have dimples is also 50%, okay? 2 out of 4. So it doesn't matter how many children they have, every individual, every offspring would have the same probability. So for this cross, they had a 50% chance of having dimples, 50% chance of having no dimples, whether they're the 3rd child, the 4th child, the 5th child, the 10th child, okay? All right, let's do the next one. All right, sickle cell anemia is a human genetic disorder known to be caused by a recessive allele. So I'm going to start just writing out my alleles so that way I know. I don't want to do S because it's hard to tell the lowercase from the uppercase. So I'll do A for anemia, okay? So it says sickle cell anemia is a human genetic disorder known to be caused by a recessive allele. So sickle cell, I'm going to put it as my recessive allele. A couple plans to marry and wants to know the probability that they will have an affected child. In the following scenario, use your knowledge to give the families the probability of having a child with sickle cell. So I'm going to do sickle cell as my recessive, and I'm going to do no sickle cell is my dominant. Okay. The man and women do not have sickle cell. However, each one has a parent with the disorder. So if they do not have sickle cell, they must have the genotype of AA, or they must be homozygous dominant or heterozygous because they don't have sickle cell. But we have to decide which one is it. They both have one parent with sickle cell. That means that the parents' with sickle cell must be homozygous recessive, because if you have sickle cell, you must be homozygous recessive. So this parent must pass on a recessive allele. Okay? So if it's going to pass on a recessive allele, that must mean that our parent here must be heterozygous. Both of the parents must be heterozygous because they don't have sickle cell, so they have to have a dominant allele. And because they both have a parent that was homozygous recessive, they must be heterozygous. Okay? So my cross is going to be between heterozygous and heterozygous. If you don't understand how I got heterozygous to heterozygous, then feel free to ask me a question, and I'll try and answer it for you one-on-one. All right, go ahead, make your Punnett square to give the families the probability of having a child with sickle cell anemia. Okay, so when I made my Punnett square, no sickle cell is the dominant trait, so no sickle cell, no sickle cell, no sickle cell. There's a 1/4 chance that a child will have sickle cell. So what is the probability of having a child with sickle cell? 25%. 1 out of 4, 25%. Okay, now it says the man is affected by the disorder. The woman has no family history of sickle cell anemia. So first we want to say, what are the likely genotypes of these parents? So the man is affected by the disorder. So he must have homozygous recessive sickle cell. Before I give the answers, always try to do it yourself, okay? So he must be homozygous recessive because he has sickle cell. But the woman has no family history of it at all. So I'm going to say that she's homozygous dominant, that she doesn't have any alleles for sickle cell. So if we were to do this cross, you can go ahead and do the Punnett square. Okay, so what is the probability that they have a child with sickle cell? Well, it's 0%. 0% probability of a child having sickle cell, but 100% chance that their child is a carrier for sickle cell. Okay, so 0% chance probability of having a child with sickle cell, but 100% chance of their children being carriers for sickle cell, which is important because then they know that they should be aware of having a partner who is also a carrier for sickle cell. Okay, let's continue. Okay, this is our last question of this study video. Try to do it on your own first, and then, of course, see how I do it if you're having trouble. The genes for dark eyes, brown, are usually dominant over genes for blue eyes. A man and a woman have 24 children. Of the children, 17 have brown eyes and 7 have blue eyes. What are the genotypes of the parents? What I notice here is that this is a 3-to-1 ratio about. Okay, so if I take 24 and I divide it by 4, that means about 25% of the kids would be about 6. Would be 6 kids. Okay, so I kind of think of it in 4s because our Punnett square is in 4s, right? So if they have 24 kids and we divide that by 4, it equals 6. Okay, so 25% is represented by 6 kids. So I'm going to say about 25% or 1/4 have blue eyes. Okay, have blue eyes, and 3/4 about have brown. So this gives me an idea of my Punnett square. If you think 6 times 3, it would be 18. Okay, so it's very close to this ratio 1 to 3. What Punnett square would give me 3 dominant phenotypes and 1 recessive? Okay, so what parental genotypes? A 3 to 1 ratio, if you do the different Punnett squares, is usually heterozygous. Okay. Okay, it's really difficult for me to draw the Punnett squares, but you can see here's an example. A heterozygous cross will always result in 3 of the dominant phenotype and 25% of the recessive phenotype. So I can tell from this ratio that both parents would be heterozygous. Okay, and I can pick my allele. So I'm gonna say, like, since it's B, I'm gonna say heterozygous crossed with heterozygous. B for brown blue. Okay. All right, that is the end of this study video, and I will post another study video for the other types of inheritance. Bye. Good job, you guys. Don't give up.